I asked last night at supper when Douglas and Patrick were with us if they knew the name Sancho Panza. And Patrick, to his great credit, and knew it right off. But how many of you remember that name? Ah, the English teacher's over there, I know. Sancho Panza. Do you remember your world literature? Maybe not, obviously. Several of you graduated several years ago, I know, and so you may have forgotten some of that, but there was a book called Don Quixote, written by Miguel Cervantes, and of course, the man of La Mancha. And many of us have read Cervantes' classic, but likely it's been a few years, I would imagine. But the story simply goes, this middle-aged man named Alonso Quixano Cervantes, a skinny little bachelor, but a lover of chivalrous romances. He basically loses his mind and decides to become a valiant knight. He names himself Don Quixote de la Mancha, names his bony horse Ricanante, and he gives his beloved girl the sweet name Dulcinea. In a few days' time after this, Don Quixote puts on a rusty suit of armor that he's found, and he sets out on his first adventure. And he is knighted at an inn by the innkeeper, who is not a prince or a king. But this inn, Quixote thinks, is a castle. And he defends a young shepherd from his angry master, and he receives a beating from some merchants. And everybody is ignorant of the rules of, being a knight. So he returns to his village to recover, and there he enlists this stable boy peasant named Sancho Panza to be his squire. And he set out on a second adventure. And in their travels, you remember some of this, Sancho and Quixote encounter a lot of imaginary enemies, giants that turn out to be windmills, thank you, enchanters that turn out to be just angry mule skinners, and abductors who are really just peaceful friars. Wherever they go, people mock them and give them beatings because their ideas are so strange and ridiculous. They free a group of prisoners at one point who thank them by stoning them. And you probably remember some of those of Quixote's perils, the fight with the windmills, and just the ridiculousness of it all. But The Man of La Mancha, that you may know, was a 1965 musical, and based on the novel Don Quixote, but it was a Broadway musical. And the story is changed a little bit. It still tells the story of this mad knight who had lost his mind and who's thrown into prison for taxing, I believe it was a monastery. They tried to collect taxes from the monastery, and the Spanish Inquisition folks threw him in jail. So the play goes. And the play and the movie, by the way, where Peter O'Toole was the man of La Mancha and Sophia Loren was Dulcinea, we probably remember that more than the book. But in that play, probably the most memorable thing is the song, "To Dream the Impossible Dream." Right? Okay. Well, the closing scene in both the movie and the play has Quixote mounting the ladder from the dungeon, going up to the Inquisition trial and his certain death. In the story, you may remember that Quixote has been humbled, and he's reverted back to reality. He no longer thinks he's this knight, but that he's just Miguel Cervantes. But as he begins to climb the ladder, knowing that his end is near, he stretches to his full stature of the Man of La Mancha, of Don Quixote, the noble knight. And he lifts his eyes up toward, in a sense, toward the guillotine. And standing behind him is Sancho Panza, this dim-witted, hunchback squire. And cowardice is all over Sancho's face as he realizes what's about to happen and the consequences of all the years of following this nut, this crazy man. But then when he sees the courage, the resolute spine, the vision and the uplifted eyes of this man who dared to dream the impossible dream, Sancho begins to imitate Quixote. And all of a sudden his back is straight, his eyes are clear, his joy is full as he steps on that first rung of the ladder, knowing that at the end of that is both death and glory. Today's lectionary doesn't include verses 32 through 34 of Mark 10, but I think it's a bit unfair to leave those out as we look at this passage. And so here it is, verses 32 through 34. Now I want you to remember Sancho Panza. Keep that in mind. Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. There are three key elements in those verses that really make what happens next, what happens in our passage that we read in the lectionary, from the lectionary, very interesting. First thing, Jesus was walking ahead of them. The second, they were amazed. And the third, those who followed were fearful. Jesus was walking ahead of them. So what? I mean, maybe nothing really unusual about that, right? Jesus probably led their journeys most of the time from out front. And he is committed to returning or to going to Jerusalem. So what then was the point of Mark pointing out that they were amazed and that those who followed were afraid? Maybe something had changed in Jesus' attitude and general demeanor. Maybe Jesus was really beginning to feel the weight of what was facing him in Jerusalem. Maybe he throws his shoulders back and puts on his chin out and begins marching with something more than just a casual stroll. He's just shared with the disciples for the third time what's going to happen in Jerusalem, this time with a bit more detail. And the air around their fellowship has changed. It's charged with a resolve that Jesus has. And in the words of the prophet Isaiah, set his face like a flint. Jesus is riding point on this journey. And those following are beginning to understand more and more of what's really ahead. The 12 are beginning to grasp the fact that this ride is about over. Jesus has made it clear that at Jerusalem, he's going to be betrayed, condemned by the Sanhedrin, transferred to a Roman court, subjected to mocking, spitting, scourging, and then crucified, and then resurrected on the third day. The third time within the space of just a few, probably weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, during this time, that he's pointed that out to them. The 2 previous occasions that Jesus foretold his death resulted in Jesus rebuking whoever argued about it, and as they were involved in questioning about it. This time's different, though. There are things coming to a head for the 12, and it's time to establish a hierarchy. You and I would have done the same thing. I mean, what's the old saying? Nature abhors a vacuum. And it's the same with leadership. As they're looking toward Jerusalem and what Jesus has made clear is going to happen, they know, somehow, beginning to understand that leadership is going to change. James and John are the first to voice what all 12 are likely thinking. Teacher, we'd like for you to do for us whatever we ask. Would you have loved to share that with the teacher that you just didn't really like in school? Teacher, Ms. Peace, I'd like for you to do whatever I ask you to do. Whew. I wouldn't have done it, at least not for Linda. But anyway, there's that bold. We want you to do whatever we ask. And can you just imagine the look on Jesus' face when he hears that? And the response is basically, oh, okay, fellas, what do you have in mind? Well, you see, we've been thinking, we've been with you all this time, and well, every great movement has to have a hierarchy, a structure. And well, we know things are about to get really interesting, looks like, and so when that happens and you come into your kingdom, we'd like to be your right-hand men. Well, one on your right and one on your left. You know what we mean. Mom suggested it to us. Dad would love it. By the way, Mom suggested it back in Matthew's account. And you know what we mean. And maybe Jesus looks at them straight in the eye, and this time he doesn't scold. Instead, he simply asks, are you willing to endure what I'm going to endure? Yeah, they answer, we will. And Jesus assures them that indeed they will. But the position that they're looking for, they're hoping to attain, will not be one of honor and prestige and power. And at this point, the other 10 disciples are angry, mostly because James and John beat them to the punch. Jesus calls them together, kind of like you'd huddle up on a football field as this crowd is going, and it's a much smaller crowd than when we were feeding 5,000, a few months ago. This is a much smaller and much more committed crowd because if you remember, a number of folks have decided not to follow at this point. But he pulls the 12 out in this little group out of the crowd to have a little family discussion. Fellas, you know how the world works, right? Powerful people, rulers, lord that power over those that are subject to them, right? I mean, that's the way the world works. Jesus doesn't condemn that, in fact. Great men and women exercise authority over those of lower station. Those are the standards of rank and power in this world. The higher the rank, the more power those people have. But listen closely to what I'm about to tell you. It is not so among you. Whoever desires to be great among you shall be your servant. Jesus is in the business of upsetting all the accepted standards of the world. He is categorically rejecting rank and power and establishing servanthood as the standard of greatness. Servant becomes the highest box on the organizational chart. Why? Because the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I believe it was along about that point that the disciples really began to understand what Jesus had been telling them, what he told them already at least 3 times before. We just have those 3 times recorded. That when they got to Jerusalem, it would not be a bloodless coup or a hostile takeover. It wouldn't be a peaceful transition of power or some brokered agreement between Jesus and the religious leaders of the day and the Romans. No, the price of this kingdom that Jesus was bringing was his literal blood, his literal life. And I picture this little huddle, this little family meeting that Jesus had called them together with the 12 of them looking down at their feet, maybe glancing up occasionally, hoping not to make eye contact with the person that they were beginning to understand was the suffering servant that the prophet Isaiah had foretold. And then Jesus, turning toward Jerusalem with shoulders back and head held high, resumed this march to Jerusalem and all that waited there. And the 12, or at least 11 of them, like Sancho Panza, stepping on that first rung of the ladder behind Don Quixote, silently falling in line behind Jesus, but no longer walking along, jockeying for position or arguing about who was going to be the greatest and who was the favorite, but walking along with this new understanding of what greatness really is. May we do likewise. May we have the courage to serve, regardless of the title that we may have, whether it's president or chairman or coach or mother or father or pastor or elder or executive or doctor or whatever. May we be given a renewed understanding that all those titles are secondary to servant. Thanks be to God.